Now, one of the issues I've always had with both conservatives and libertarians in terms of how they look at the police is they've got a really good grasp of the small picture view of things. Uh, Whereas I suspect the progressives, or at least people who are in the planning areas of progressivism, have a much better grasp of the big picture. The little picture view just looks at a particular community and says, hmm, is crime increasing here or is it getting better? So whereas a progressive view looks at the police as a whole. So what do I mean by the police as a whole? Okay, if you took the combined number of police officers in the United States, not counting support personnel and stuff like that, but people who actually carry a gun and have arrest powers. If you combine that as a group, the US police would be the sixth largest army in the world, just a little bit ahead of Russia. Uh, it's a massive prize. If you can wield that power in a way you want, or at least cause it not to be wielded the way your other side wants, it's a massive, massive political advantage. And this is something the progressives grasp well, and this is something a lot of libertarians and conservatives do not. So I guess the best way to handle or to understand uh, how it all works is to look at the history of it. Yes, John only has one tool, and it's a hammer, and the hammer is history. So here we go. Okay, so if we look in the United States, pre-colonial times and essentially through the early 1800s, how policing worked, we essentially copied the English system, which would make sense because we were overwhelmingly English at the time. And what they would set up if a town was experiencing issues, because not every town had problems. I mean, a town that's small enough or everyone kind of knows each other doesn't have a whole lot of issues. But so the initial system would essentially have the establishment of constables and a night watch. Constables were appointed by government officials. It was an official position. The night watch varied heavily from city to city. They could be volunteers. They could be people who are being punished for something and forced to do a form of community service. They also could be being paid by the people. Now, so what is a constable? Uh, Constable is a peace officer with less authority and a smaller jurisdiction than a sheriff, empowered to serve writs, warrants, and make arrests. So what would happen is the night watch would act as the constable's muscle. The night watch was primarily meant as a deterrent. They technically, I mean, the concept of citizen's arrest is way back in Old English common law, so theoretically anyone could detain somebody, uh, but obviously you could be legally challenged to determine whether the detainment was legitimate or not. When the night watch got paid, they were generally paid by citizens groups or particular merchants or rich people in town, and that varied from place to place. Another element of the policing system was something called thief takers. They would be an analog to bounty hunters in our day. And essentially, a thief taker, somebody would either hire them or offer up a reward for the return of the stolen property or bringing the criminal to justice. And that's how the thief takers worked. Sometimes, and they had a lot of the skills of a bounty hunter. They knew how to do basic detective work, and uh, they would interact with the constables and the Night Watch, but they were fully independent. One of the reasons why this was the particular system that was stood up was the general fear of a standing army. And that fear of a standing army would continue to have this as our primary system of policing the big cities up until about the 1840s. Now, once you got outside the city areas, you had what were known as vigilantes and regulators. Now, vigilantes gets a really, really bad name because of the situations where they got out of control. However, for the most part, vigilantes uh, kept the peace. You don't hear about the stories where essentially, and vigilante essentially comes from the word vigilant, uh, and regulators were people who were attempting to maintain order. Both of these were examples of spontaneous order. They were citizens groups that would spring up. They would essentially come up with their own, may not be written. It could be just a spoken charter saying, this is our mission. We're here to keep this particular area free of this particular activity or activities. Sometimes these groups would get paid. Uh, and there are obviously occasions where you have groups like this would exceed their authority, sometimes being like bought off by people to ignore their charter, other things like that. But for the most part, they worked fairly well because it happened everywhere there was an issue. And obviously, we don't hear endless stories of vigilante actions. We only hear the, couple dozen salacious incidents because uh, a vigilante group essentially doing their rounds for 5, 6, 7 years and never causing trouble and actually diminishing crime isn't much of a story, is it? Okay, so as cities would get bigger, they were running into it was getting harder and harder for the night watch to be everywhere they needed to be. And so the deterrent effect was dropping. So merchants would start hiring essentially private security. Sometimes this would be in the form of just hiring a group of men to uh, act as security. Sometimes it would actually be companies offering their services as security. And so generally what would happen is the merchants, either an individual merchant who had like a very maybe valuable storefront or a valuable warehouse or whatever it was, would set up security for his areas. Essentially, and sometimes the merchants would group together to make more efficient security, like having patrols around like a warehouse district or a merchant district. Uh, and so the security would act as essentially point defense and area defense, depending on how they were hired. Now, the probably the biggest problem with the Night Watch is not. I mean, essentially, since it was drawn from the general population, on any given night, uh, your night watch could be completely ineffective to being absolutely diligent. I mean, you might have one group of men who took their mission seriously, tried to cover all the major areas, and did their job, while others might find a place to duck in and hide and drink for the night rather than go out and do their work. So one of the big so the police system initially comes from England. Uh, they started up uh, their London police force in the 1830s. Their police force would become the model for ours. Now, the one thing that made England very different from us is theirs was instituted from the central government, the Peel system, Robert Peel, thus where the term bobbies come from. Now you know. But anyway, so they always had a centralized, codified system of this is how our police force works. And as it spread to other towns, they literally just copied and pasted. So all their police force uh, was regulated and partially controlled by the central government. A portion of the funding for the police came from the central government because the central government wanted to use the police as a uh, potential military force in times of absolute need. The goal, the English basically created a quasi military model for their police system, one which we, of course, copy today. Now, what made the change happen from the old system to the new system is once the merchants got involved and they were hiring their own private security, and you have the night watch and the thief takers and all this other stuff. The merchants started getting mad, thinking, well, every place we have our security patrolling becomes crime free. And so there are a lot of adjacent neighborhoods that they thought were free riding, where they're like, well, they're getting the benefit of what we're doing. We're paying for this, and they don't give us anything, yet they get the benefit of it. So the merchants used their power to press the governments to create a police force as a public good. So what they were doing is passing their costs off to the taxpayer and spreading it around. Okay, so the police forces started in the largest cities on the East Coast and slowly spread inward, generally based on city size, and little by little it would slowly go down to lower population levels as the particular cities decided that it was worth their while to do this. One thing that's a major red herring with the whole police thing is there are people who will absolutely insist that slave patrols are essentially like the foundation of the police force, which is utter total nonsense. The slave patrols were, in fact, uh, a uh, uh, came out of the militia system. Now, in the United States, up until probably 1830s, 1840s, every state had a mandatory militia system where everyone was expected to be called up from time to time and drill, and they would have exercises, and it just didn't seem to be really working too well. In the North, by the time the Civil War came around, the militias were completely disbanded. Uh, the state-run militias, and what came in their place was private militias. And these private militias worked great. They are actually, uh, when Lincoln called up the militias, when he feared Washington D.C. might get cut off by Maryland seceding, Massachusetts militias were able to deploy to Washington D.C. within 72 hours of the call up. Remember, telegraphs and trains. But the militia system in the South stayed in place because uh, the Southerners used the militia as the slave patrol as well. So they figured, well, as long as we got all these boys together and they're out, with their guns playing around and drilling and all that stuff, might as well just march them around and create a show of deterrence against slaves, so they think twice about escaping. So there is no relationship at all between the slave patrols and policing. It was purely, it was an adjunct of the militia system, and ultimately it was not a particularly popular one either, other than for, of course, the richer slaveholders. So, another issue that would also drive the want for police would be the new immigration waves coming in from Germany, Ireland, and Eastern Europe. So a lot of these large towns were relatively tranquil when they were ethnically uh, similar. As different ethnic groups came in, uh, each had their idea of what was law and order. I mean, the Germans might get rowdy in the street, pouring out of the tavern late at night, which would be very injurious to someone of originally English heritage, and someone who might be very devoutly Protestant. So the idea came that essentially the original inhabitants uh, of the cities used their influence because typically the people who were there first are wealthiest. The people coming in as immigrants have to build up from the ground up. So the people with the wealth used the police forces as a way of enforcing their ideas of law and order on these new people coming in. So the first police force units were very small. They were typically drawn from the neighborhoods that they lived in. And so they lived and worked in the exact same place. They were typically hired by the lowest level of politicians, generally a ward boss or whatever the precinct leader was. And these police forces had no detectives as of yet. The thief takers were still the primary instrument of tracking down crime that had already happened. The police units were primarily there as deterrents. And I'm going to take a quote here from Encyclopedia Britannica, which actually has a really excellent article on the history of the U.S. police. Okay. The major strength of the decentralized approach was that it brought the police and the public in close contact. Police knew the local citizens and were often recruited from the very neighborhoods they policed. Such close contact allowed the police to spot troublemakers, identify local problems, and provide various public services. On the flip side of it, it was weak on it was good on deterrence but weak on enforcement. It also had jurisdictional issues because their power only existed in a small segment of a city. So New York was broken up into I don't know how many voting precincts, but there were probably quite a few. And each precinct had their own little police force, and they could not chase a criminal across the lines of the precinct. We'd start to see the creation of detective departments in the 1860s. Often a lot of these were former thief takers. One of the big problems is it was a money talk situation. So even though these detectives working as police might be receiving a salary, and they were receiving a salary, they were also taking money on the side, expecting people to pay for their services in terms of, give me money and I'll go try to chase that thief down for you. So this created a bit of corruption because if a person could be bought to go after a criminal, they could potentially be bought to not go after a criminal. They could potentially be bought to look the other way for certain people. They could be bought to go after other people with a little bit more gusto. Interestingly enough, the corruption level was so bad in the detective units that most of them were disbanded within 10 years of their formation. Obviously, later that detective unit thing would start back up again. I'll explain the circumstances of that. So the police forces were tied to precincts, and this precinct is the exact same thing as the voting precinct. So essentially, the same little jurisdictional line that broke up the city into voting precincts or wards were the same areas that were policed by the police. So this would ultimately create kind of a prize, a struggle for control, if you will. Uh, Whoever controlled the precinct controlled the police leadership. They got to appoint the police leadership, and they also got to pick who the police were. So they could pick people that they knew were very loyal to them, the local ward boss or the local precinct boss, and that would deter that person would determine, since he was picking what would be the equivalent of the local police chief, and it probably didn't use that term quite yet, but whoever was the local police leader and whoever was the local police, uh, they could decide what laws were enforced and who was the target of law enforcement. Also, this would lead to a lot of corruption because you'd have people bribing the local ward boss to get a police job. And a lot of times, this kind of the kind of people who would pay to get a police job, a lot of times had things on the side that they were trying to protect from the police. So obviously there was an issue with patronage and job buying. But the other big problem is because this precinct boss was also in control of the police. He would typically use the police for political things as well. So they might set up and essentially intimidate the wrong people from coming to vote at the ballot box. They might threaten or possibly beat up political rivals. So it wasn't, I mean, obviously it wasn't horrible everywhere, but obviously where it was bad, it stuck out like a sore thumb. So what this would cause to happen is as new immigrant groups came into the cities, they would do everything they possibly could to congregate their numbers and domicile in a particular precinct or ward so that they could seize control of the political apparatus and thus control the police of that area. Thus, they could get the police to enforce the way they wanted to. So, if they had particular ways they did things that our old English ancestors weren't happy about, if they controlled the police, they didn't have to worry about the issues of being enforced against in a way they didn't want. Okay, so here's another quote from Encyclopedia Britannica. This explains essentially the next step up. So like I said, police could not follow someone through a jurisdictional boundary, so they couldn't go from precinct to precinct. So interjurisdictional crime waves in the second half of the 19th century, to deal with it, states enacted laws giving many business corporations the authority to create their own private police forces or to contract with established police agencies. For example, the Coal and Iron Police of Pennsylvania was a company police force that later became notorious for its anti-labor enforcement. The most famous independent police force was the Pinkerton National Detective Agency, created by Alan Pinkerton, a political fugitive from Scotland. Pinkerton Agency provided a whole array of private detective services and specialized in protecting trains, apprehending train robbers, strike breaking, and other activities directed against labor unions. Now, so this is basically the system we are looking at from probably about 1870 to about 1920. We have these precinct level police forces. We have these now cross-jurisdictional private police forces being set up by various companies. And we have essentially a battle for control of the police forces, a political battle. So prohibition made things worse. Imagine that. So essentially, when you have this, you create a situation where you have criminals who are making vast amounts of money with illegal activities. This is a system that is rife for being essentially bought off and corrupted. And essentially, if the police force, and it's hard to get a good feel for this, but for the most part, that system prior to prohibition was working in some places. In other places, it wasn't. And obviously, there would be in the good places there would be pockets of bad, and in the bad places there would be pockets of good. Um, so prohibition completely wrecked the system and made it unfunctional. So this would result in a very big push for reforms. These reforms were primarily spearheaded by dun 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 the progressives. Imagine that. Uh, so the primary thing progressives ended up doing was they changed the jurisdiction. They basically created police precincts that did not line up with the political voting precincts, and they would enlarge these precincts. And in most cases, creating citywide police departments with a handful of precincts under them, depending on how big the city was. So they also created the professional police force as a civil service rather than a patronage organization. So what it did was it took the police a step away from the individual people and closer to the power of city political leaders. And this would dramatically increase the power of the city mayor. This is where we moved from uh, a lot of at least political diversity across the various precincts to essentially political hegemony enforced from the mayor level down. Now, I want to get into a little thing. This is a little bit odd, but bear with me on it. Uh, Essentially, once progressives centralized the police department, their goal was to continuously centralize it more, because the more you centralize it, the more control you can move to the top. Because local control isn't what progressives like, it's national control is what they like. So there's actually a dual effort by progressives and uh, people who adhere to communism uh, as a way of to control the police is essentially to control the nation. And I want to take an excerpt from a piece R.J. Rushdoony wrote. And I realize he's a little bit infamous. His religious beliefs might be a little bit out there for you, but he was pretty solid as a paleoconservative and definitely one foot in the libertarian camp for sure. The word police comes from the Greek word polis, and polis was the Greek city-state. In size, it varied from a single city or port to a city and its environs. So that is best comparable to a modern city. Police, in the true sense, are locally controlled and hence decentralized agency, which is unrelated to other police bodies or of other cities or counties and lacking any national federation union. The police properly are city and county law enforcement men. 2. The police are not a military body, even if in uniform. They are civilians in every sense of the word, and their authority is a civilian authority. The police are supported by local property owners whose agency they are by means of a tax on property. The entire support of the police is local and it is from the property tax. Their orientation is accordingly local, and the protection of life and property is their essential task. They are thus essentially a non-political body. The local orientation of the police means no national responsibility. Federal law is outside the jurisdiction of the police. The police are not only supported by local citizenry through a property tax, but also their source of power and authority is by delegation without surrender from the local citizenry. Men can elect a councilman or a congressman and delegate to him the right to vote on their behalf. They do not possess and they do not maintain a right to vote in those bodies themselves. It is a privilege held by the member of the electorate in that person, in the representative officer. But the citizenry does not surrender its police power to the police. It is a delegation without surrender. Every citizen retains the right to exercise as needed its police power, the right of citizen arrest. This right, of course, is under law, as is official police arrest, in each case subject to legal fences designed to protect the rights of the innocent and the orderly process of law. True police power thus is in the citizenry and not in the state. It is not delegated, it is delegated but not surrendered. This is the identifying mark of the true police. It is a source, and it is a source of offense to the totalitarian order. The police are an aspect of the local citizenry's self-government and of their right to self-defense. Attempts to destroy the police by destroying their purely local nature are veiled attacks on the right of self-defense. So, essentially, since the progressives launched their centralization effort in the 1920s, there has been a continuous effort to try to figure out how to nationalize local police. And the initial efforts came from federal grants, the idea of the federal government makes money available, sends it down to the police, and then has strings attached which tie them to some federal functions. Where this really got heavily underway is when Republican progressives under the Bushes pushed for police militarization. Militarization of the police is a stepping stone to nationalization, because if the federal government is providing military level of equipment, there are always going to be strings attached, and they can always use the threat of taking the military equipment away should the police not behave in the way they want to. This attempt to alter or seize power of the local police has more recently showed up in the effort of defunding the police, and also in the terms of DAs being supported in their elections by large overseas donations. If the DA refuses to enforce what the police are doing, they essentially make the police useless. They destroy the morale of the police. They make the functionality of it different than what its intent is. So what are the goals? Well, one of them is very similar to our old precinct fights, where the local politician would fight for control of a precinct in order to control the police. Well, we are seeing the same thing happening in some of the larger cities. A good example of the empowerment of the political class. In Portland, we have a situation where the government will not allow the police to shut down Antifa checkpoints. The Antifa will set up checkpoints where they will stop vehicles, check out who's in there, and not allow certain people to go through, and the police do nothing about it because they're under directions of their local city not to interfere with what Antifa is doing. So, good example of directing the police to basically go after one group of people and not another. Uh, I think other goals is the idea of the degradation of police ability to the point. So, if you take money away from the police, we see that crime goes up. So it's not taking money away from them isn't as effectual as having police who are funded. DAs who have equity ideas in terms of sentencing and bails and other things like that, who let career criminals run out, basically undermines what the police can do. It's degrading the police's ability to do their job. So why would you do that? Well, one possibility could be is that if the big city police departments are degraded to the point where uh, they can't control crime and the citizens are outraged and angry, that at some point someone at the national level goes, "Gee, all these police departments don't work. What we really need to do is nationalize things, bring in big money from the federal government, and also make sure we have federal government regulators in there to keep the police from becoming too racist and all this other stuff." Uh, and oddly enough, I think this is an example where I think Republicans are stupid enough to fall for this, where because of their impetus to do law and order, if the local police departments are failing, I think they're stupid enough to get conned into nationalizing the police at some level, or at least creating the initial steps in the idea of, we've made the police forces better, so therefore law and order's improved. We've done a great job. And then again, the progressives will step in and pervert it to their needs. Now, I want to make it very clear I am a libertarian. I know our police system has absolutely horrible flaws. It needs massive reform. But I think that reform should be taking place on a city by city basis and not top down. I would say very clearly that defunding the police with no other plan doesn't work. In the cities where it's happening, crime is spiraling out of control. Uh, I would rather have a slightly dangerous police force out there keeping law and order uh, at a certain level of expense, as opposed to a defunded police force that just goes meh when the crime comes to my neighborhood. Again, I don't think what we had before defund the police was great, and I think there are alternatives to it. Uh, but just defunding with no other plan is not a plan and doesn't work. DAs who don't enforce are clearly there for purposes that aren't for the benefit of the whole. Uh, so defund the police and DAs who are doing equity enforcement are not your friends. Uh, at some point, we can talk about alternatives to the current police structure, but these two ideas are not them. So, hope you found that interesting. What do you think? Do you have any alternatives for what we could do with local police? Do you agree with what I was saying here about the attempt at the progressives of both parties attempting to centralize power to nationalize the police so that they can have the sixth largest army at their disposal? All right. Well, thank you for spending time with me tonight. Hope to see you again in another video. Please smash the like button if you like this. Also, subscribe if you like this content. If you know someone who might find this interesting, please share it with them.